Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the vision of Dr. Israr Ahmad, a plan for societal change that was so complex and so widely misunderstood, it left a lot of people scratching their heads and asking one major question. So, what was it really? An armed rebellion? Some kind of new political party? Or maybe just social reform? People have slapped all sorts of labels on his movement, and honestly, it's created a real cloud of confusion. So let's try and cut through that fog and figure out what was really going on. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with why it's so confusing in the first place. Then we'll debunk some of the biggest myths out there. After that, we'll unpack the actual model he was proposing and then dig into why it failed. And we'll wrap it all up with a final, pretty unsettling question this whole thing raises. Okay, so this central confusion. The core issue, right from the get-go, was that his vision just didn't fit into a neat little box. It wasn't quite a political party, but it wasn't just a social reform project either. And because nobody could easily label it, a whole lot of misunderstanding grew from there.
All right, so to really get a grip on what his plan was, we've got to start by clearing the deck of what it wasn't. It's time to separate perception from reality and tackle some of the biggest myths that have been floating around.
And this is probably the biggest and most dangerous misconception out there. When people heard Dr. Israr talking about big, fundamental change, their minds immediately jumped to a violent overthrow of the government. But nope, not even close. Here's the absolute reality of it. The whole thing was designed to be a nonviolent ideological struggle. This wasn't about winning battles with weapons. It was about winning the battle of ideas, winning over hearts and minds. That was the entire point. So let's just lay it all out, crystal clear. This was not a revolt against the Constitution. It was not an armed rebellion against the state or the army. It definitely wasn't a plan to use a mob for some kind of violent takeover. And importantly, it wasn't a power grab for himself. It wasn't against the people at all. Okay, so if it wasn't any of those things, if it wasn't a violent revolution or just another political party, then what on earth was it? Well, let's unpack the actual model he was putting forward. It was a very specific ideological path to change. It all comes down to this one central goal, the sovereignty of Allah. The whole idea is that the ultimate authority, the final say in making laws and running society, doesn't rest with people, it rests with God. This was the absolute bedrock of his entire vision, a direct challenge to the modern secular state. So you might be wondering, how do you even begin to achieve something like that? Well, he actually proposed a very specific four-step process. First, you get your ideology straight. Then you form this core group, a Jamaat, that's not just smart, but also morally on another level. From there, that group works to get the masses on their side. And the final piece of the puzzle, the old system just collapses because it's lost all its moral legitimacy to rule. And that right there, that's the end game. It's not a violent coup, it's a non-violent transfer of authority. The idea is that society itself, as a whole, just willingly withdraws its support from the old system and gives it to this new one, a completely organic shift in allegiance. Okay, but here's the thing. Despite this really detailed, thought-out plan, the whole movement never really gained traction. It never took off. So the big question is, why? Why did this complex idea ultimately fail?
Well, it looks like there were a bunch of reasons it didn't work out. For starters, the public's perception of Sharia was, and still is, a huge hurdle. People hear Sharia and they immediately think of harsh punishments. Plus, people are just not that keen on handing over authority for their private lives. And let's be honest, the message itself was really delicate, maybe too complex for the masses to really grab onto. Some folks also just didn't like Dr. Asrar's authoritative style, and he lost a lot of support with his, let's say, less than diplomatic answers on tough questions, especially about women's roles.
It's really helpful to see his model next to Maulana Maudud's. Maudud's plan was way more direct, right? Form a political party, win elections, then legislate Sharia. It's a clear democratic process. Dr. Asrar's model, on the other hand, was way more abstract. He wasn't trying to work within the system. He wanted to basically dissolve its moral foundations from the outside through a long, complex struggle. And here's another, maybe even bigger challenge. The whole strategy was based on the prophetic model, but the context today is just worlds apart. I mean, the prophet was dealing with non-Muslims, introducing the Quran as this brand new, shocking concept. He had divine authority. He had miracles.
Today, leaders are talking to Muslims about ideas that are 1,400 years old. And, well, there are no active miracles to convince people. That's a huge difference. So, where does all this leave us? Well, it brings us to one final and honestly kind of unsettling question. It's all about the battle for the intellectual high ground. And it's a battle that might not be going the way you think.
Because here's the thing. While we often hear these big stories about mass conversions and things like that, the source material for this explainer points to a much quieter and maybe more significant trend. Just think about it this way. You might see a big news story about a prominent scientist converting to Islam, right? That happens, but it's rare. Meanwhile, there's this steady, almost silent drain of intellectuals who are becoming atheists. For a movement like Dr. Israr's, which is built on winning the intellectual argument, that's a massive, massive problem.
And that really is the thought we want to leave you with today. In this age of simple slogans and 280-character hot takes, can a really complex, deep ideological movement ever truly succeed? Is there any space left for something that requires this much thought and commitment? It's a huge question for our modern world.